everybody, and welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James, and I'll just run you through a few things before we start the actual webinar itself. So we're very lucky today to have two people joining us from the east coast of the States, where it's quite early in the morning, so special thanks to them. And I'm in Cambridge, as I mentioned. I'll just introduce our two speakers briefly. So our first speaker will be Professor G. John Ikenberry. I won't run through the whole of these slides, but he is Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton and at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He's spent two periods at Oxford University, including last year, when I think he must have been working on his book, which you can see highlighted there on the right, A World Safe for Democracy, which has recently come out. He's also got another book that's recently come out, which is an edited book called The Crisis of Liberal Internationalism, and that is, I think, focusing to some extent on Japan. He's had various roles in the US government, and he is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And then our second speaker will be Wataru Sawamura, and he is the Asahi Shimbun Washington Bureau Chief and has been there since 2017. And he's got a wide range of experience at the Asahi Shimbun around the world. He's worked in New York, London, and Paris, as well as in Washington. He was in charge of Europe for a while. And he's also got experience of China, having been a visiting scholar there for 6 months. So here is the timeline. That was my 5-minute introduction. And I will now pass over to John Ikenberry.
Thank you, James. It's great to be here, at least virtually, at Daiwa. It was 2 years ago in November, I think November 22nd, 2 years ago, when I was at Daiwa in London for the Minister Agawa talk. So that was a great moment, and I enjoyed that very much. It's great to be here and to talk about international relations and the future of global order. I'll start with the presidential election. Clearly, this has been an important election, most important, arguably, in my lifetime as an American thinking about American foreign policy. The new administration, the Biden administration, really will hold important implications for how the United States acts in the world over the next several years. The Trump administration, as we all know, has taken the United States down a very controversial, perhaps dangerous path over the last 4 years, a kind of revisionist wrecking operation on the American post-war order that was created over the last 70, 75 years on trade, on alliances, on public health, on arms control, the environment, human rights, and all these areas. The United States under Trump stepped back from its historic position as leader. And so with the Biden administration in the offing, I think we are going to see a major reorientation of American foreign policy. To those who support Biden, he is in some sense the vaccine to be used against the Trump virus, just as we have another vaccine in the offing for the COVID pandemic. Big implications, I think, await American foreign policy. I think the US will try to rebuild its global status and its position. I think the first two steps of the Biden administration will be to rejoin the Paris Agreement and to rejoin the WHO. There will be a moment of good feelings, I think, across the US-led alliance world. There will be an effort to reestablish and reassure. There will be a return, I think, to the fundamentals of diplomacy, of multilateralism, of security cooperation, of traditional leadership. I think you'll see a return to the 75-year American playbook for exercising leadership, focusing on institutions, partnerships, and affiliations with like-minded states. And I think the new team, starting with Tony Blinken as Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan at the White House as Security Advisor, and John Kerry, and I think a very important, not just symbolically, but truly important step will be a kind of climate change czar who will bring climate to the center of American foreign policy in a new way. But I must say at the outset that the Biden administration will find itself facing great headwinds as it tries to reorient American foreign policy. Trumpism runs deeper than Trump. The Republican Congress will still have a Senate majority for the Republicans, who will be already starting to talk about 2024. And Trump may not go away himself. He may run again. And globally, of course, the pandemic, the economic crisis that we see unfolding today are all reinforcing the other side of the equation, the other trends: nationalism, populism, authoritarian illiberalism. So it will be a very demanding exercise to try to reorient America's position in the world and to try to align itself with forces that are moving in the right direction. Let me now just say a little bit about some of the deeper problems, because I think we have to acknowledge them. I would argue that we are in the midst of three global crises that are deep generational crises, and they are going to make it very hard for us to govern the world, to cooperate going forward on great issues. The first is, we'll call it a crisis of geopolitics. It's the crisis of the global power transition. The US and its trilateral Western and Japanese allies, that core of what we might call the old global order, is weakening, it's shrinking, it's giving way with the rise of China and the larger non-Western, non-liberal democratic core world. It's a decades-long struggle over rules and institutions and values. It's going to last, I think, for another cycle of history for sure. Secondly, there's a crisis of, I'll call it the crisis of modernity. The intensification of economic and environmental and human interdependence. This is the arrival of the Anthropocene era, of the truly global scale problems of environment and the ability of humans to sustain their civilizations. Climate, the big three are climate, pandemics, and weapons of mass destruction, all of which pose truly existential challenges to the global community. How we respond to those challenges of modernity, I think, are going to form a lot of what becomes international cooperation in the second half of the 21st century. And the third crisis is the crisis of liberal democracy, the weakening of the old liberal democratic institutions, certainly in the United States, in Western Europe for sure, unraveling of the growth coalitions and class compromises and pluralistic ethos of these societies that have been part of the success story of the post-war era, the rise of inequality, polarization, which you see in my country, populism, the breakdown of old norms, and in the most severe form of this, a kind of worry that many of us have that the deeper, we'll call them Enlightenment values of open society, of science, of rationalism, of the rule of law, of freedom of speech, of civil society, outside the reach of the state. All of these core values that are part of that 200-year ascent of liberal democracy are themselves at risk, I would argue, for the future. Together, I think we have a very demanding environment for the next phase of trying to develop some form of global governance. I think the low point of the ability of our countries to govern themselves may have been in the spring of this year, in April 2020, when the G7 countries got together in the face of the worst pandemic in 100 years and the worst economic crisis in 75 years. And the G7 ministers could not even come up with a communique of common cause. Truly a low point. The closest parallel, I would argue, would be the 1930s and 40s, when we were at that point truly at a moment of existential crisis for liberal democracy. And I think it's to that period we need to go back to see how they, our grandfathers and grandmothers, that generation, put the pieces together after World War II. And that leads me to my next set of comments, which really are, how do we fight back? How do we rebuild the liberal international order? I've written a book about this, as Jason said, about how to think about the past as a guide to the future. And I think we have to acknowledge that the liberal order has not the international-oriented elites in our countries have not stood up well in the face of the 2008 financial crisis. In the United States, the Iraq War, I think, discredited internationalist elites. And more recently, the disappointment, you might say, about how we handled China, the failure of what might be called the liberal bet to bring China into the liberal order as a responsible stakeholder. The seeming failure of that has once again served to contribute to this undermining of a belief in a kind of liberal-oriented global order. I think the first step in rebuilding is to defend and recall the successes and not just the failures of this post-war order. We have to remember that there were things that were done well, and there are things that we don't want to give away. We did, I think, when we talk about the advanced industrial democracies, the liberal democratic states, did create something that can be called a functioning international order in the shadow of the Cold War. Regional and global institutions, alliances, partnerships, bargains, built around core convictions that we share. Four convictions, I think, are at the core of this liberal world order. One is the importance of openness as opposed to protectionism and mercantilism. Institutions, they matter. They facilitate cooperation. Thirdly, liberal democracies do have a special role to play. They have a capacity for cooperation. They have shared values that can be leveraged for creating coalitions of leadership to drive efforts at reform. And finally, in the face of modernity, in the face of rising economic and security interdependence, we have to work together. You can only be secure alone. Together, you cannot be secure alone. And under the auspices of this liberal order, our countries did a lot of work. They opened the world economy after World War II. They created a framework for Germany and Japan to reorient themselves after World War II and to become partners in this system. France and Germany composed their differences after centuries of hostility and launched the European Union. There was a platform created across these countries for allowing older industrial societies to modernize and become social democracies. In Germany, the social market system. In France, in each of our countries, we did it differently. In the US, it was the New Deal. But we all made a passage to a more modern form of social democracy. And the trilateral countries together played this central role in building institutions that still provide tools for governance. The IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the OECD. And together, finally, this complex of institutions provided a framework for integration of rising states, South Korea, other countries in East Asia that were making transitions from authoritarian rule to liberal democracy. So where did things go wrong? How can we critique and diagnose what has happened so that we can put liberal internationalism on a stronger foot? Well, I think in some ways, the failures of the last decade have been failures of success. In some sense, at the moment the Cold War ended, there was a kind of explosion of integration and mobilization of societies that overran the bargains and institutions and foundations of that order. It was a kind of a globalization of liberalism. And it didn't entirely work out, shall we say. But what we have to remember is that the order in its golden era was an order inside of the bipolar system. It was not the global system. It was a subsystem. It was the so-called free world, and it had a kind of club characteristic. The liberal democracies saw themselves working together. They were part of a confederation that saw alternatives on the other side. To be inside of this liberal order was to have protections, to have access to trade and institutions. It was to buy into a suite of responsibilities and obligations. So to be inside was to give states benefits, but it also required obligations. And with the end of the Cold War, this liberal order lost that club character, and countries could join and integrate in different ways. And as I argue in my book, the club turned out to not be as effective as it used to be, and the liberal order turned into a kind of shopping mall where you could kind of wander in and you could join the WTO, but you didn't have to buy into the other values and responsibilities. And in some sense, this is the story of China. So I think in one important respect, need to remember that as we try to rebuild the liberal order in the new era, where there really is an opportunity, I think, with the Biden administration to realign and reorient and rethink and reinvent. And my last comments are really just to kind of say a little bit about what we might think about as the agenda for the future. I think the Biden administration is on the wavelength that I've been giving you this morning. I think there will be an effort made very early in the new Biden administration to rebuild and reaffirm alliances. President-elect Biden has said that one of the first things he wants to do is organize a kind of community of democracy meeting where like-minded states, not just the old G7 countries, but a larger array of countries come together and reaffirm their international commitments to each other and their agenda for strengthening the fabric of international order. Secondly, I think there will be an effort to bring down the temperature, so to speak, on globalization. The Trumpian America First ideology is really an attack on globalization. And the liberal international vision needs to, in some sense, separate itself from that caricature and remind people that liberal internationalism, as it's been handed down from the 1945 period, has not really been about tearing down borders and globalizing the world. It's about creating capacities among governments to manage interdependence. That's a more pragmatic, world-weary, opportunistic, reform-oriented agenda. We are in the midst of a world we can't totally reshape. We are going to live in a world of economic and security and environmental interdependence for our lifetime, but we can manage it. And that's the task of liberal internationalism. And then finally, I think we need to, and I think this is felt very closely by the Biden team, particularly Jake Sullivan, who will be the national security advisor, who has spent the last 2 years trying to reattach internationalism to domestic politics. That to be an internationalist is not to give up on how people in everyday lives live their lives, to create a connection between the betterment of your lives in middle America, in my country, or everyday people living everyday lives, and the international world. That connection got broken after the end of the Cold War, and it needs to be reestablished. That to be internationalist is to build capacities to make domestic societies work better. Now I have about 5 minutes left, so I'll just turn to East Asia and to China. I think this is where a lot of the foreign policy of the Biden administration and a lot of the debate about the future global order will focus. Whether the US-China relationship, Japan's role in East Asia, all of these questions are going to be front and center. I think we have to acknowledge the reality that a Biden administration is not necessarily going to bring about a more cooperative relationship between the United States and China. Remember that Biden campaigned for president as a China hawk. And I think Biden will try to do several things in relationship to China. Obviously, as I said before, he will try to rebuild the alliances, including the East Asian alliances. And if South Korea and Japan and other countries want to do this as well, there's going to be a strengthening, not a weakening of the security framework in East Asia. Secondly, I think Biden, more so than Trump, will focus on human rights. There will be talk about the young people in Hong Kong. There will certainly be attention to Taiwan, and there will be attention to the Muslim minority in China, which is oppressed. So there may be more tension because Biden will pay respects to human rights in the way that Trump did not. I think there will be efforts to support the TPP. I don't think that this will be an initial thing. I don't think the TPP is going to get passed by Congress in the first year or two. Jake Sullivan, I don't think is that enamored with it. I think Tony Blinken is more supportive of TPP. I think there will be probably initially bilateral trade agreements that will be pursued and then a bundling of them that might occur. And then finally, with regard to East Asia, read the speeches by Michelle Flournoy, who may be the next Secretary of Defense. She's very focused on reestablishing deterrence broadly across East Asia, but in particular with Taiwan. The great threat of a war, of an inadvertent war in East Asia, could well be Taiwan. That's the flashpoint that many of us worry the most about. And the way to establish some stability there is to reestablish deterrence. And I think that's the Flournoy position, and I think that will be the Biden position. Finally, I think that there's been a sea change in American foreign policy thinking in the Washington establishment, one that I've been reluctant to join actually, but one that has soured really on China and soured on the ability to engage China. Since that the world has moved on from the liberal vision of trying to integrate China into a unified system. That's been my view for years. I think that the new consensus is more about the return of what is called great power rivalry, that China has made a decision to move in the direction of autocracy and even drifting to totalitarianism. That is creating a true kind of ideological challenge. China is not just a great power problem, it's a modernity problem because it offers a very different ideology of the future. Capitalism without democracy and liberalism. So this is a future that where the great contest about how the 21st century will play out is on the table again. And if that's true, competition's not going to go away. And so I'll just end by saying, is there a bright spot? And I would say yes. And that would be what looks like a new gathering of thoughts about climate change. There may be a way in which, despite all the competition, which is not going to go away, there can be a new convergence of effort on tackling climate change. This is a global issue. That's a non-zero sum issue. And think about what's happened recently. The Chinese have made a pledge for carbon neutral, a goal for 2060. Japan has met China's pledge with a goal to be carbon neutral by 2050, and then South Korea joined in. And I think Biden is going to, and indeed has said so in his speeches, to pledge American efforts to move towards a carbon neutral economy by the middle of the 21st century. So this is an area where we can have what we might call, to borrow a phrase from John Lewis, the great civil rights leader, good competition. He called it about good trouble. That's what he called civil rights activism. But good competition with China, to coin a phrase, would be a kind of competition to see who can lead better on taking us into a world where we pollute less and generate carbon for climate change. China pollutes, puts 27% of the carbon emissions into the atmosphere. The United States puts 15%. So together they put about 42% of the world's carbon emissions into the atmosphere. So this is an area where I think there's an opportunity to forge some pragmatic agreement to move forward in a post-Trump world order. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, John, for summing up so many massive issues globally in such a short period of time. So before we get to the Q&A, and we've already got quite a few questions coming up on the chat, let's hear the Japanese perspective from Wataru Sawamura of the Asahi Shimbun.
Well, thank you very much, Jason-san, for your kind introduction of mine. Good afternoon, everyone in the United Kingdom and Europe. Good morning to our viewers in the United States. And good evening for participants in Japan. Can you hear me? Okay. Yep. Oh, it's my great honor to be part of this well-timed and important seminar, and also be given the precious opportunity with one of the most distinguished intellectuals in the United States with regard to democracies, Professor John Eichenberry. I am also very much delighted to be here because I spent 3 years in London from 1998 and another 2 years from 2011 again as a correspondent. I'm so happy to find my old friends among today's participants. And it is not too much to say that London is my second hometown, where I spent almost 6 years in total. My son was born there, and especially I still keep wonderful memories what participating a lot of seminars at your Daiwa Anglo-Japan Foundation. Of course, events at Foundation were so fascinated, but I also enjoyed walking through very beautiful Regent's Park to get to the Foundation. Particularly, my memory of London in November comes with the fireworks. In Japan and also in the United States as well, fireworks are one of the summer features. But in the United Kingdom, it is a seasonal event in early winter or late autumn. And I remember I enjoyed the fireworks warming up with hot wine, sometimes drink too much. I assume everything has changed in London and in many cities in Europe due to COVID-19 pandemic. I wish all of you would have good recovery, and I hope everything is getting normal next year. And as I mentioned, it was in May 2011 when I started the second assignment in London. And it was just 2 months after the March 11 tragic earthquake, tsunami, and consecutively followed horrible nuclear power plant meltdown. I was in Tokyo back then, and we spent highly tense and horrified days when nobody was able to tell you exactly what would happen on next day. I must say I have had a little bit similar experience in Washington, D.C. back in last April and May. Major cities such as New York City and Washington, D.C. started lockdown, and our downtown Washington became as a ghost town. And then we had a tragic killing of George Floyd and enormous anger among American public against injustice. Well, let me go back to my memories in 2011. A lot of diplomatic missions, foreign embassies, and the consulate in Tokyo had closed or moved to further western part of Japan, even to Hiroshima, to escape from possible radioactive fallout from Fukushima. I even remember some of the foreign journalists were standing in front of the camera or reporting wearing a heavy-duty mask in the middle of Osaka. One of the few countries which decided to keep staying in Tokyo and continue their operation was UK. UK embassy was in full operation even in the middle of the crisis, and I believe many Japanese people really appreciated it. Talking about Japanese appreciation to foreign countries, I had also to point out the tremendous supporting given by United States as well, which conducted huge and comprehensive military operations for rescue, restoration assistance for affected regions, and logistical support to contain nuclear incidents. It was called Tomodachi Operation, which means friendship operation. In addition to it, I should not forget mentioning the one important American person who was remembered by many Japanese people because he visited heavily affected area in Tohoku in the summer of 2011. He offered flowers for tsunami victims and gave comforting words for survivors. That person's name is Joe Biden, Vice President of the United States of that day and current President-elect of the United States. I think Mr. Biden is still remembered as political leader who is capable of showing empathy and compassion to the people who suffered hard times and tragedies. Now the United States itself is suffering the COVID-19 pandemic most severely in the world. Economic breakdown as well, huge loss of employment, social and economic inequalities, racial injustice, which are directly linked with the mortality by COVID-19. I'd like to say that American people finally decided to choose the political leader who is capable to listen and understand the grievance of ordinary peoples. Now, President Trump has not yet admitted the defeat of election and not made concession, but he finally decided to start the transition. Today, I'd like to speak how Japan and the United States would build or rebuild a strong bilateral relationship, assuming Mr. Biden is next president. Probably many audience today would be curious to know if new Japanese Prime Minister Suga and President Biden would establish a strong personal relationship as one like between former Prime Minister Abe and Mr. Trump. Oh, that was true that Mr. Abe was one of the few Western leaders who had successfully made a good personal relationship with Mr. Trump, as well as Boris Johnson and Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel. Why was it possible? Abe-san had really refuted back to what Trump had said. He never made fun of him in public and carefully tried not embarrassing him. And Mr. Abe was the first state leader who had direct meeting with Trump at the Trump Tower in New York City after his presidential election victory. Or it would be viewed as problematic from diplomatic protocol. Trump was a political outsider and knew nothing about foreign policy back then. And he did not trust his own bureaucracy either. He really appreciated Mr. Abe's advice on how to develop the policy towards Asia, especially with China and North Korea at the beginning of his presidency. Of course, we shouldn't forget their same affection for playing golf. So in other words, it was only effective option for Mr. Abe to gain Trump's personal trust. If you think about the way how Trump conducts decision-making without traditional or institutional diplomatic process, and without advice from foreign policy experts, or without carefully constructed strategy. So I interviewed a couple of times with John Bolton since last summer when he published his memoir about his experience as a national security advisor. In interview, he told me about Trump-Abe relation and how Mr. Abe had shown self-constraint while he had meeting with Trump. According to him, Mr. Abe always listened to Trump with great patience, never hit back on what Trump had said. Mr. Bolton also mentioned that it was, of course, impossible to understand what Mr. Abe was really thinking about Trump, but he said he thought how difficult and stressful it was for Mr. Abe. So I am almost 100% sure that Suga-san would not have had a good relationship with Trump. It's not because Suga-san is not a golf master, but a karate master. He is not from political celebrity like Mr. Abe. He's a sort of self-made tataki-age type of politician. And he is not good at flattery. He is a practical person and no nonsense. He hates a lengthy phone call, and quite opposite of Trump, who spent almost entire morning time twittering and telephone calling. So joking aside, while his presidency, Mr. Trump has become more and more confident about his instinctive policy decision and less relied on his advisors. He never truly trusted persons other than his inner circle, including his family. I believe that there was no possibility for Suga-san as being treated by Trump as a sort of foreign policy advisor like Abe-san. So how we can conclude and evaluate the last 4 years of US-Japan relations? Leaving aside its superficially good personal relationship, we have to admit Mr. Trump's commitment to Asia was terribly weak. He rarely participated in multinational dialogue in Asia, such as East Asian Summit, ASEAN, APEC, and so on. His last-ditch hard-lining anti-China policy was not based on the coherent and comprehensive strategy, but more based on his signature America First, and with his personal political interests, such as denying previous administration achievements while pursuing his personal legacies. So withdrawal from multinational frameworks such as TPP or WHO and so on just only paves the way for China to fill in the vacuum after US has gone. So with regard to historic summit with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, it has never made any substantial or effective agreement to stop its nuclear and missile program. While Trump was getting along well with Chairman Kim, North Korea was given plenty of time to improve their capabilities, given green light for short and middle-range missile testing, and got reduction of suspension of US-South Korea military exercises. I don't think those would enhance stability in East Asia, which is most crucial goal for Japan. His decision makings are always embarrassment, and it really like money matters. You would make money or save money, that is his main goal. But there are also some comfortability with Trump as presidency for Japan as well. That he is indifferent about other nations' foreign policies. So as everyone knows that Japan and South Korea bilateral relations had deteriorated dramatically last 4 years. Obama administration had tried facilitating dialogue between two nations, even made pressure behind closed doors. But Mr. Trump does not care about those conflicts between allied nations. He did not show any interest nor concern on Japanese politics and policies and contributions on global issues such as climate change, mass migration, and so on. So hypothetically, if Trump would have won this election, his second term would have been more unpredictable, more relying on his instinct, more focused on just making deals to achieve personal legacy than achieve long-term goals. Now, next question is how new US and Japan relations would be looking like with new leadership of Suga-san and Biden-san. How the role of those leaders' personal relation matters. So Suga-san and Biden-san have a lot in common. Both are originally from commonality, not from celebrity family. Self-made type of politician, as I said, spent a lot of years in real party politics, conducting on more maneuvering skills, rather than showing strong personality or charisma. Long time as number two, nobody expected to become number one. In Japan, we have a significant growing voice expressing expectation to Biden. He already promised to work closely with traditional US allies. So US would return back to multilateral framework. There is growing feeling of relief among Japanese policymakers that Biden would pursue more traditional institution-based approach rather than heavily personalized approach. However, there is also growing concern in Japan about Biden's policies. Historically speaking, there is a sort of notion that Japanese government had been getting along better with Republican administration than Democratic presidency. Also, some people pointed out that even though Biden's position is centrist and moderate, but his policy platform would be more and more influenced from progressive inside Democrats. Above all, typical skeptical comments on Biden's policy in Japan are about his policy toward China. So there is a sense of trauma among Japanese policymakers that Obama administration, especially during his first term, was too naive facing the rise of China, not only as economic superpower, but its growing ambition to militarily and technological superpower. And those soft attitudes are perceived by Chinese leaders as green light paving the way to more aggressive approach. I personally think Japan should not feel relieved that US would be returning back to traditional diplomacies. I also think Japan should not worry too much on Biden's China policies. Yesterday, as Professor Ikenberry mentioned, it was reported that Mr. Anthony Blinken will be nominated as the next state secretary. Mr. Blinken repeatedly said that China is now biggest concern, called China as a strategic challenge. And this view is already broadly shared very much not only with bureaucracies, but also with bipartisan consensus at the Congress. There's growing concerns about China's rise as a military power as well as a division of power, threatening dominant US hegemony regarding technology and also rule-making power. Of course, for Democrats, human rights issues are also a very important issue. In addition to that, it's better to keep in mind that Biden was elected in presidential races with flipping Rust Belt states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, where there is still strong sense that lots of employment had gone to China. We could observe that there are touches of protectionism element among Biden's policies, but I do think hardlining trade policy to China would somewhat continue. So I'd like to say that we should more pay attention to Biden's priorities. Without doubt, his most important priority is how to end COVID-19 crisis and rebuild the American industry, the economy, and the societies. And then climate change. Not only among progressive, but also among young American generation, new business leaders in the United States are getting more vocal on climate issues these days. There are possibilities that Biden would pursue big deals with China to make a broader consensus to tackle against COVID and climate change. So another possible political issue is North Korea. It's very easy to predict that sooner or later, North Korea will resume provocative action, showing their ambition for ICBM and nuclear capabilities. So Mr. Biden will not pursue direct negotiation with authoritarian leader nor dictator like Trump did. Therefore, it is inevitable path to pursue the involvement of China to pressurize North Korea for stability of the Korean Peninsula. Another concern of mine is that Chinese view on US has been dramatically changed the last 4 years with Trump administration. That is notion of declining of the United States. There seems growing notion in China that liberal democracy does not function well, divides the country, not able to contain pandemic, not able to get out of economic malaise, very inefficient. Its America First policy is undermining US interest in global trade and also with regard to US influence in global institutional and framework. That is why China might have greater chance to seek hegemonic positions. In that sense, we fully understand that Biden is going to focus more on also domestic issues, bring back its strengths and national unity, which I think is a very challenging task as well. But I believe it is quite essential for the United States winning back self-confidence so as to seek legitimate competition with China before it will be going out of control. That's where we can find Japan's crucial role in global order and relation with the United States. Japan is already in the heart of the regional free trade agreement with CPTPP, RCEP, and also FTA with the European Union. Post-war Japan always regards the United Nations as an important multilateral cornerstone working for global agendas. Also, Japan is part of G20, APEC, working on dialogue with Asia, ASEAN countries. So as Japanese journalists, we are obliged to be watchdog of Japanese politics and be safeguard for Japanese democracies. But if I compare with other Western nations, it's very fortunate not to see steep rise of violent populism. Of course, there is indeed, and we have to be vigilant to it, but still manageable. On the other hand, Japan already experienced some challenge which other countries would follow, which is aging population and demographic declining. Japan is a developed country facing challenges and has lots of things to share with other nations. Based on those contexts, I'd like to point out 3 keywords which I think are crucial concepts for US-Japan relationship in the future and its contribution for a global order. Our first keyword is capability. Mr. Trump's 4 years really showed us that even global power and free and open democratic beacon country like the United States might be falling into populism with authoritarian touch. And COVID-19 has already shown that those populism is really ineffective and incapable to tackle against global crises such as pandemic. Of course, we should not follow the same approach as in other authoritarian states like China. As I told, the most important priority for Biden's administration is ending COVID-19 pandemic and rebuilding the economy. So it is essential for countries like Japan, South Korea, Germany, Australia, Canada, and so on, where we fairly manage COVID crisis with keeping democratic norms and transparency, would form like-minded nations of capabilities with United States. We need recovery, but moreover, we need good model of recovery. The second keyword is big picture. I think Japan should address its willingness to commit global issues with big picture, such as public health crisis, climate change, nuclear proliferation, inequality, mass migration, and so on. It is said that Mr. Suga's signature policy are lowering mobile telephone fee and creation of digital agency in the government. It is good to promote political agendas which are close to Japanese people's everyday life and also the efficiency of government. But I would like to expect Suga-san would be more vocal on global agendas as well. He announced that Japan will achieve zero carbon emission by 2050. I think it is a very good start. What I expect him is not promoting certain type of ideology nor nationalism, but pursuing a practical and effective approach for goals of big pictures is United States and other countries, including United Kingdom. Third keyword is diversities. I'm sure that next Biden's cabinet and the White House would be very diversity with lots of women, people with color, and the young generation. It is already announced in the United States that next United Nations ambassador would be African American women, and also first Hispanic Homeland Security Secretary. It is also reported Treasury Secretary and top of intelligence agency are going to women as well. I am feeling a little bit nervous when I imagine US-Japan ministerial meeting with full of old men with dark suits in Japanese side and very diverse members in US counterparts. Of course, demographic is not same between two countries. However, it's time for Japan to change our mindset and to highly value the diversity and making efforts to have more women or younger generation in our politics. Lastly, it is needless to say that Japan should be always very democratic and have better relationship with neighboring Asian nations. So it was not bad that Prime Minister Suga picked up Vietnam and Indonesia, two Asian nations, for first official visit. But we should make far more great efforts to normalize the relationship with South Korea. Thank you very much for listening.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think we're pretty much running out of time now. We've gone a bit past 2 o'clock. So really, it just remains for me to thank you both for fascinating presentations and for answering all of those questions. I'm sorry we didn't get around to all the questions in the chat, partly because I lost some of them. But thank you very much to all of you, many experts in the audience as well. And so thank you so much for participating.